The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes with the early morning, when the world is still waking up and the air is crisp with the promise of a new day. No, this was an eerie, unnatural quiet that settled over my orchard like a thick fog. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that makes you feel like you're being watched, even though there's no one around. Normally, my orchard was alive with sound. The birds would be chirping, their songs weaving through the trees like a symphony. The leaves would rustle in the wind, a gentle whisper that carried the scent of apples and earth. And then there were the bees, my honeybees, always busy, always working, their low hum a constant backdrop to my mornings. But that morning, there was nothing. Just an unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. I stepped out onto the porch, my coffee mug in hand, and scanned the orchard. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The trees stood tall and proud, their branches heavy with fruit, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. And then I saw it. The broken branches. The scattered leaves. The gaping emptiness where my prized apples should have been. My heart sank. Half of them were gone. Not windblown, not eaten by animals. Stolen. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I surveyed the damage. The branches were bent, the leaves crushed underfoot. There were footprints in the damp soil, clear as day. Someone had been here during the night, creeping through my orchard like a thief in the shadows. I already had a good idea who was behind it. Her name was Vanessa. Just the thought of her made my eye twitch. Vanessa was my new neighbor, the self-proclaimed suburban queen who had moved in next door a few months ago. From the moment she arrived, she had been nothing but trouble. Vanessa had a sense of entitlement that was almost impressive. She seemed to think that moving next to a farm meant she could do whatever she pleased. She had already helped herself to my eggs, borrowed firewood without asking, and even tried to claim my pond as her personal picnic spot. But this was the final straw. My golden apples weren't just fruit. They were my pride, my hard work, and more importantly, my ticket to winning the county fair this year. And now, some of my best ones were missing. I clenched my fists as I examined the mess. The way the branches were bent, the footprints in the damp soil, it was obvious someone had been here during the night. I rushed to my barn, where I had set up a trail camera a few weeks ago. If my gut was right, I'd have all the proof I needed. With a few clicks, I scrolled through the footage, my blood pressure rising with every second. And there she was, right on my screen, caught in the act. Vanessa, creeping through my orchard with a sack slung over her shoulder, plucking apples as if she had planted the trees herself. My jaw tightened as I watched her, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. But what really sent my blood boiling was what I found next. She had the nerve, the absolute gall, to post on her social media the next morning. There she was, posing with a smug grin, holding a fresh glass of homemade apple cider. The caption read, "Nothing beats fresh apples from my own backyard." Her backyard? My jaw nearly hit the floor. She was bragging about my apples like she had grown them herself. The comments were full of admiration. "You're so lucky to have fresh fruit," one person wrote. "What a beautiful harvest," another gushed. I could practically hear Vanessa basking in the attention. Oh, she thought she was clever. Thought I wouldn't notice. Thought she could get away with it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. This wasn't just about apples anymore. This was about principle. I could have marched right over to her house and demanded she return every last one. But knowing Vanessa, she'd just play dumb, bat her eyelashes, and spin some excuse about how the apples were technically on her side of the fence or some other nonsense. No, confronting her now wouldn't work. If I wanted justice, I needed to be smarter. So I waited. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I took a slow walk around my orchard, pretending to inspect the trees. In reality, I was setting the bait. A fresh batch of apples, perfectly ripe, placed right where she wouldn't be able to resist. But there was a twist. Each one had been lightly coated with a thin layer of my finest honey. And if there was one thing my bees didn't take kindly to, it was someone messing with their honey. The next morning, I didn't even have to check the camera to know my plan had worked. The screaming did that for me. Vanessa's voice echoed through the air, a high-pitched wail of panic and fury. I leaned against my porch railing, sipping my coffee and watching the show unfold. There she was, flailing wildly in my orchard, her hands coated in honey, her hair in disarray as a swarm of bees chased her in frantic circles. Every time she tried to swat them away, they only got angrier. She shrieked, tripping over a tree root and stumbling straight into my chicken coop, where my hens, already ruffled from the commotion, flapped and pecked at her in protest. She stumbled backward, arms flailing, and with one final desperate attempt to escape, she dove straight into my pond. A loud splash followed by furious quacking filled the air as my ducks, unbothered by her distress, swam around her, pecking curiously at her hair. I nearly choked on my coffee. Vanessa emerged from the pond, dripping wet, her once perfect designer yoga pants clinging to her legs like a second skin. She stomped toward my house, still swatting at imaginary bees, her face red with rage. "You!" she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You did this on purpose." I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Did what?" "You were on my property again," she sputtered, opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air. Your bees attacked me." "My bees?" I tilted my head. "They don't usually bother people unless they sense a threat. Or, if someone's covered in honey." Her face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You're going to pay for this." I could have had an allergic reaction. I could have. "You could have stayed off my land," I cut in smoothly. "Seems to me like you got exactly what you deserved." She gasped, outraged. I'll call the sheriff." "You assaulted me with bees." I let out a slow, amused chuckle. "By all means, call him. Let's see what he has to say about you trespassing and stealing my apples. Oh, and while you're at it, maybe ask him if bee stings count as karma." Her expression flickered with hesitation. She knew she had no case, and she definitely didn't want the sheriff involved, especially since he was a good friend of mine. Her lips pressed into a thin line, fists clenched at her sides. Without another word, she turned sharply and stomped back to her house, dripping water all the way down the dirt path. I watched her go, shaking my head in amusement. She'd be back. I was sure of it. Vanessa wasn't the type to take defeat gracefully. But for now, I had won the first round. And next time, I'd be ready. The next morning, I expected some kind of retaliation from Vanessa. But instead, the silence returned. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made you feel like something was brewing just beneath the surface. I wasn't stupid enough to think she had given up. Vanessa wasn't the type to let things go. She was just plotting her next move, and I needed to be ready for it. Sure enough, it didn't take long before she showed up, marching toward my porch with the same dramatic energy of a person about to demand to speak to a manager. She was still red-faced from the bee incident, her arms covered in faint pink welts, and her hair, once always perfectly curled, was still slightly frazzled from her unplanned swim in my pond. You think you're real clever, don't you?" she snapped, her voice laced with barely contained fury. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to watch her squirm. "What are you talking about?" I finally asked, feigning ignorance. She scoffed, throwing her hands in the air. "Don't play dumb. You set me up. You lured me in with those stupid honey-covered apples and let your disgusting bees attack me." I tilted my head, amused. "So, you're admitting you trespassed again?" Her mouth opened, then shut. Her eyes darted left and right, as if looking for an escape from her own words. Finally, she squared her shoulders, deciding to take another approach. "It's your fault," she said firmly. "If you hadn't been so selfish with your apples, I wouldn't have had to take them. If you weren't so inconsiderate, I wouldn't have had to go to such lengths." I stared at her, genuinely baffled by her logic. "You're telling me that you stealing my apples is my fault?" She folded her arms. "I have kids, you know." I raised an eyebrow. "You have a 19-year-old son who drives a sports car and a husband who owns a boat. I think you can afford to buy apples." Her face twisted in annoyance, but she quickly covered it up with a dramatic sigh, shaking her head as if I were the one being unreasonable. "It's not about money. It's about fairness. You have so much, and I have so little." I nearly choked. "You have a brand new in-ground pool and a weekly housekeeper." She ignored my comment. "You farmers think you own the whole world just because you have a little bit of land. But the rest of us have to live here too. And frankly, I think you should be more generous with what nature gives you." I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Vanessa, nature didn't give me those apples." "I did. I planted those trees. I pruned them, watered them, protected them from pests, and spent years making sure they produced good fruit. That's not nature. That's hard work." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. They're just apples. My patience snapped. Then go buy some from the store. Her nostrils flared, and for a second, I thought she might actually stomp her foot like a child. Instead, she took a deep breath, plastered on a fake sweet smile, and said, "Fine, if that's how you want to be. But don't expect me to be friendly after this." I let out a laugh. "Vanessa, you stole from me. I don't exactly wake up hoping for your friendship." She huffed and stormed off, but I wasn't naive enough to think that was the end of it. Sure enough, 2 nights later, I heard a rustling outside. I peeked through my window and spotted a shadow moving through my orchard again. She was back. I grabbed my flashlight, a small bucket of honey, and my secret weapon, the scent of revenge. I crept out the back door and circled around, silently stepping lightly on the grass. Vanessa was too busy stuffing apples into a tote bag to notice me. She wasn't even being careful this time. Maybe she thought I was asleep. Maybe she thought I wouldn't dare pull another trick. Either way, she was about to regret underestimating me. Without a word, I took the bucket and flicked a generous amount of honey onto the ground around her feet. She didn't notice right away, but my bees did. The moment the thick scent of honey hit the air, a low hum started up from the nearby hives. Vanessa finally caught on when she took a step back and felt the stickiness under her shoes. What the? Then she heard it too. The buzzing grew louder. She froze for a second, eyes darting around, and then, just as realization dawned on her, the swarm began to move. The first bee landed on her sleeve, then another on her hand. She let out a shriek and flung her arms, but that only made things worse. More bees landed. More buzzing filled the air, and before she could think, she was running. But Vanessa, in all her panic, had forgotten about the chicken coop again. This time, she tripped over the fence and crashed into it, sending a dozen outraged hens fluttering in all directions. They squawked in alarm, pecking at the intruder who had dared to disturb their slumber. Feathers flew, and so did Vanessa, scrambling to get away. But she wasn't done making bad choices. In her frantic dash, she veered straight into the pond, just like before. Another loud splash. Another round of furious quacking from my ducks. By now, I was doubled over laughing, tears in my eyes as I watched her flail in the water. She finally dragged herself out, covered in pond scum, feathers, and honey, her once expensive pajama set completely ruined. She turned to me with wild eyes, chest heaving, pointing an accusing finger. You, this is harassment," she screeched. I grinned. "I didn't touch you, Vanessa. Nature did. Guess nature decided you needed a lesson." She gaped at me, sputtering, then spun on her heel and stormed off toward her house, dripping water with every step. I watched her go, shaking my head. I knew this wasn't over. Vanessa wasn't the type to accept defeat, no matter how many times nature humbled her. But I wasn't worried, because no matter how many apples she stole, no matter how many schemes she tried to pull, I would always be 2 steps ahead. And I had plenty of honey left. The morning after Vanessa's latest misadventure in my orchard, I expected some kind of dramatic retaliation. Maybe a call from the sheriff with a completely fabricated complaint. Maybe another angry rant on her Facebook page. Or perhaps even a surprise visit from some overpaid lawyer she had dug up to threaten me with. But instead, I got silence. No screaming. No accusations. No sign of her stomping over to my porch to demand an apology. Just an eerie, unnatural quiet that made me wonder if she had finally learned her lesson. I should have known better. Around noon, just as I was finishing up some work near the barn, a familiar set of wheels rolled up my driveway. Sheriff Tom stepped out of his truck, adjusting his belt with the same casual ease he always had when he knew he was about to deal with some small-town nonsense. I leaned against the fence, already guessing what this was about. "She called you, didn't she?" I asked, not even bothering with a greeting. Tom let out a tired sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She sure did. Said you've been weaponizing bees and conducting biological warfare on civilians." I couldn't help it. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the rake I was holding. Biological warfare? Tom, I run a farm, not a military base. She also claimed you set honey-based booby traps on your property to cause bodily harm. Tom continued, though I could see the amusement flickering behind his eyes now. "I already told her trespassing on private property means you get whatever consequences nature throws at you. But she's insisting I handle the situation, so here I am, officially handling it." I crossed my arms, shaking my head. Let me guess, she didn't mention the part where she was stealing my apples again. Oh, she left that part out entirely, Tom said with a smirk. Lucky for you, I'm not new at this job. I wiped some sweat off my brow, glancing toward the orchard. So what do we do? You going to give her another warning? Tom's smirk widened. Nope. I'm finding her. That actually surprised me. Finding her. She's got a history of this, and we both know this isn't her first offense. Technically, she's been warned enough times, and now she's caught in the act. A nice little trespassing fine should make her think twice next time. He paused, then added with a shrug, or at least it'll be fun to watch her throw a fit about it. I chuckled, shaking my head. That woman thinks she's above every rule in town. This is going to be the best entertainment I've had all year. Tom didn't even try to hide his grin. I'll go let her know. If I don't come back in an hour, assume I've been taken hostage by a very angry Vanessa. As Tom drove off, I went back to work, whistling a little tune as I tended to my bees. Sure enough, not even 20 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of Vanessa's voice carrying across the property. Even from a distance, I could hear the outrage spilling out of her. This is harassment. I was the victim here. He lured me into a trap. I'll take this to court. I'll go to the mayor. Vanessa, Tom interrupted, his voice as calm as ever. If you keep shouting, I'm going to have to write you up for disturbing the peace too. That seemed to shut her up, at least momentarily. I stayed near the barn, pretending not to watch, though I had the perfect view of her flailing her arms and stomping her foot as Tom handed her the fine. She snatched the paper out of his hand, glaring at it like it had personally insulted her. This is ridiculous, she hissed. All over a few apples. Tom folded his arms. Lady, this is over you constantly trespassing, stealing, and causing problems for your neighbors. The apples are just the latest in a long list of nonsense. Vanessa let out a dramatic huff, waving the fine in the air. You'll regret this. This whole town will regret this. She spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming her door so hard I half expected her windows to rattle. Tom walked back toward his truck, shaking his head with an amused chuckle. You know, he said, some folks just can't help themselves. I grinned. Oh, I know. But I have a feeling she's finally learning that actions have consequences. For the next week, Vanessa stayed quiet. No surprise visits. No fake complaints. Not even any passive-aggressive social media posts. It was almost too good to be true. And then, just when I started to think maybe she had actually learned her lesson, the final twist arrived. One of my neighbors, old Mr. Jenkins, showed up at my farm with a knowing smirk on his face. You hear the news? He asked, rocking back on his heels. I wiped my hands on my jeans. Depends on what news we're talking about. Vanessa put her house up for sale. I blinked. She what? Jenkins laughed. Yep. Guess she's had enough of country life after all. Someone told me she was ranting about uncivilized farm folk and how she can't live in a place where people let bees run wild. He let out another chuckle. Looks like you finally ran her off. I let that sink in, a slow grin spreading across my face. Well, I'll be damned. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it sure was a satisfying one. I had spent months dealing with her entitlement, her tantrums, and her ridiculous attempts to get away with anything she pleased. And now, in the most poetic twist of all, she was leaving on her own. No more stolen apples. No more fake complaints. No more sudden appearances demanding things that didn't belong to her. That evening, as I sat on my porch with a fresh glass of iced tea, I watched the sunset over my orchard. The golden light filtered through the trees, my bees hummed peacefully, and my apples were exactly where they should be. For the first time in a long time, everything was quiet. Vanessa had come into this town thinking she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. But life had a way of humbling people, especially those who refused to respect the world around them. And in the end, the farm had won. Nature had won. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting out a satisfied sigh. Sometimes, justice doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes, all it takes is a little patience, a few bees, and a whole lot of honey. With Vanessa gone, life on the farm returned to its peaceful rhythm. The birds sang, the bees buzzed, and the apples ripened under the warm sun. I continued to tend to my orchard, knowing that every apple, every drop of honey, was a testament to my hard work and dedication. As for Vanessa, I heard she moved back to the city, where she could enjoy her in-ground pool and weekly housekeeper without the inconvenience of bees or nosy neighbors. I couldn't help but smile at the thought. She had tried to take what wasn't hers, but in the end, she learned that the farm and nature always had a way of balancing the scales. And so, life went on as it always does. The seasons changed, the apples grew, and the bees continued their tireless work. And I, standing in the middle of my orchard, knew that no matter what challenges came my way, I would always have the strength, the patience, and the honey to see them through. Just when I thought life on the farm had settled into a peaceful rhythm, a new chapter began. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I was out in the orchard, inspecting the trees and enjoying the quiet hum of my bees. The golden apples hung heavy on the branches, their sweet scent filling the air. It was a perfect day, or so I thought. As I made my way back to the house, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of the house next door. My heart sank. Vanessa's house had been on the market for a few months, and I had hoped it would stay empty for a while longer. But it seemed fate had other plans. I watched as a young woman stepped out of the truck, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, and her hands stuffed into the pockets of her oversized flannel shirt. She looked around, taking in the surroundings with a curious expression. She didn't look like Vanessa, that much was certain. But still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension. I decided to give her some space and let her settle in. After all, not every new neighbor was going to be a nightmare like Vanessa. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her name was Claire, and she seemed nice enough. She introduced herself with a warm smile and a firm handshake, and she even brought over a basket of muffins as a housewarming gift. But there was something about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started small. A few missing eggs here, a misplaced tool there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I had misplaced the eggs, or maybe one of the chickens had hidden them. But as the days went by, the incidents became harder to ignore. One morning, I found a trail of footprints leading from my chicken coop to Claire's house. They were faint, but they were there. My heart raced as I followed the trail, my mind racing with possibilities. Was Claire stealing from me? Or was it something else entirely? I decided to set up my trail camera again, just to be sure. If Claire was up to something, I wanted to catch her in the act. But as I reviewed the footage over the next few days, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Claire seemed to be keeping to herself, and there was no sign of her trespassing on my property. But the incidents continued. More eggs went missing, and I even found a few of my tools scattered near the edge of my property, close to Claire's house. It was as if someone was trying to send me a message, or maybe just mess with my head. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. So one evening, I marched over to Claire's house, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, she opened it, looking surprised to see me. "Hey, Claire," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I need to talk to you about something." She raised an eyebrow but stepped aside to let me in. Her house was cozy, with warm lighting and a faint scent of lavender in the air. It was a stark contrast to Vanessa's cold, sterile decor. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone cautious. I took a deep breath. "I've been having some issues on my farm. Eggs going missing, tools being moved. I even found footprints leading from my coop to your house. I just wanted to know if you've seen anything suspicious." Claire's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. "I haven't seen anything," she said quickly, "but I'll keep an eye out. I promise." I studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, but she seemed sincere. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, Claire had been nothing but kind since she moved in. "Okay," I said finally. "Thanks. I just wanted to make sure." She nodded, and I turned to leave. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. A few days later, I was out in the orchard, pruning the trees and enjoying the cool autumn breeze. The bees buzzed around me, their hum a comforting reminder of the hard work I had put into the farm. But my peace was short-lived. As I made my way back to the house, I noticed something strange. The door to my barn was slightly ajar, and I could hear faint rustling inside. My heart raced as I approached, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it Claire? Or someone else entirely? I pushed the door open slowly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. And there, in the corner, was a figure, small and hunched over, rummaging through a pile of hay. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the barn. The figure froze, then slowly turned around. It wasn't Claire. It was a young boy, no more than 10 years old, with wide eyes and a guilty expression. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice firm but not unkind. The boy hesitated, then mumbled, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to steal anything. I was just curious." I crossed my arms, studying him. Curious about what? He looked down at his feet, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I heard about your farm. About the bees and the apples. I just wanted to see it for myself." I sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "So, it wasn't Claire after all. It was just a curious kid. What's your name?" I asked, my tone softening. "Ethan," he said quietly. "Well, Ethan, if you want to see the farm, all you have to do is ask. But sneaking around and taking things without permission isn't the way to do it." He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm really sorry. I won't do it again." I reached out and ruffled his hair. "It's okay. Just promise me you'll come by and visit properly next time." He smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. "I promise." After that day, Ethan became a regular visitor to the farm. He was fascinated by the bees and the orchard, and I found myself enjoying his company. He was eager to learn, and I was happy to teach him. Claire, it turned out, was Ethan's aunt. She had taken him in after his parents passed away, and they had moved to the countryside for a fresh start. She apologized profusely for not realizing what Ethan had been up to, and I assured her it was okay. Kids would be kids, after all. As the weeks went by, Ethan and I developed a routine. He would come by after school, and we would work together in the orchard, tending to the trees and the bees. He was a quick learner, and I could see the same passion for farming growing in him that I had felt at his age. Claire, too, became a part of our little community. She would often join us in the evenings, bringing over homemade treats and sharing stories about her life in the city. She was nothing like Vanessa, and I found myself grateful for her presence. As autumn turned to winter, the farm buzzed with activity. The harvest festival was just around the corner, and I was determined to make it the best one yet. With Ethan and Claire's help, we prepared the orchard, decorating the trees with lights and setting up stalls for the visitors. The day of the festival was perfect. The sun shone brightly, and the air was filled with the scent of apples and cinnamon. Families from all over the county came to enjoy the festivities, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I watched them explore the orchard. Ethan was in his element, showing off the bees and explaining how they made honey. Claire helped run the cider stand, her warm smile drawing in customers. And I, standing in the middle of it all, felt a deep sense of contentment. As the sun set and the festival came to an end, I gathered everyone around for a toast. "To new beginnings," I said, raising my glass. "And to the people who make this farm feel like home." Ethan and Claire smiled, their eyes filled with gratitude. And as we clinked our glasses together, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with friendship, hard work, and the sweet taste of honey. The years passed, and the farm continued to thrive. Ethan grew into a young man, taking on more responsibilities and eventually becoming my partner in the business. Claire remained a constant presence, her kindness and warmth bringing joy to everyone around her. Together, we built a legacy, one that went beyond the apples and the honey. It was a legacy of community, of hard work, and of the bonds that tied us together. And as I stood in the orchard, watching the bees buzz and the apples ripen, I knew that Vanessa's shadow had finally faded. The farm was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a home, filled with laughter, love, and the promise of a bright future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.